I'm Ernst Zundel with another Voice of Freedom program coming to you from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. We have been doing what I consider some mega project, a mega series on what happened before, during, and after the Second World War. And we have been looking at all kinds of books and documentation about what really is little known in the world, and that is the Holocaust of the Germans. Most people have heard of the Holocaust of the Jews because these people whine incessantly and have friends in high and low places, and they have dominated. Victimhood has basically been kind of preempted for them or copyrighted. Well, I'm a son of Germans, and after a book came out in the United States that was so utterly disgusting and blanketly kind of told the world that the Germans were out there holocausting every Jew in sight, I decided that something had to be done, that this was negative stereotyping of the worst kind. I'm referring to this massive tome here. It's called Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans and the Holocaust by Daniel Jonah Goldhagen. It was a British policy of continental balance of power always. But you see, was it British, or was it a policy of the oligarchy, of the banksters, as I call them, meaning the banking interests and gangsters, obviously, that have dominated British policy since Cromwell's time? And we know today, from research done by David Irving, for instance, that when Chamberlain was removed and Churchill got to the helm, that Churchill's backers were people like Bernard Baruch, whom we have discussed in previous parts of this series, the advisor and banker to presidents, and in the Bernard Baruch, wealthy American Jewish financier who had been in charge of the War Production Board in America already before the war, had made horrific suggestions for crippling Germany at the Versailles kind of reparations called Peace Conference, and was right in there with Henry Morgenthau, your American Secretary of the Treasury, who concocted that deathly plan to virtually wipe out a great number of Germans. One estimate put it at 32 million Germans were too many. Then we came finally to this book by Theodor Nathan Kaufman, a Jewish intellectual and writer, who said in this book that the German nation should be exterminated through sterilization. Detailed plan reviewed by Time magazine, it's called it a sensational idea. The New York Times says a plan for permanent peace amongst civilized nations. And so finally I decided enough was enough, and I was going to put out this series of programs which you have seen, heard, or which you are about to hear and see. We talked about this disastrous balance of power politics that those oligarchy, those making up the bankers, the kind of aristocrats, the moneyed interests and so on in England and also in America were engaged in order to stop the Germans. I returned to this book, Gruesome Harvest, an American book published in 1947, and I'll quote from it because I don't want you to think that I, the German, am going to give you German sources. I want to give you Allied sources, American sources, British sources, so that you cannot claim to me that I'm the Nazi propagandist here giving succor to Adolf Hitler. I am a German. We are sick and tired of being kicked in the dust and having our heritage besmirched. This is my way of doing my part to getting it back, so that you, Americans, Canadians, Britishers, and so on, can face up to the policies that were maybe not done in your name, because you are too young, but certainly were done in your father's and grandfather's name. And if it's good and right and proper for the Allies to keep blaming the German generation, wartime generation, for all the ills of the world, I want you to look at your policies to see what share you had in it. We have already covered in the last program the disastrous British power policy of balance of power in Europe. And here is what this writer says. Although the German attack against Poland was considered a high moral international wrong, when Russia also attacked and Britain failed to oppose this aggression, which was also a brutal stab in the back, but continued the war against Germany alone, it became clear to many observers that something more was present in the situation than readily met the eye. There was a secret rider attached to the treaty, which has since been made public and which stipulates that the expression "a European power" employed in the agreement is to be understood as Germany. Hitler didn't know that apparently at the time, that Germany alone was to be attacked. And they were waiting for the British to attack the Soviet Union. Nothing happened. In other words, Britain was taking advantage of the situation to go to war against Germany, because the German Reich had become too strong and had upset the European balance. To correct the fundamental trouble from Britain's point of view, Germany, after her defeat, must be weakened as a protective measure. No morality enters into the matter, only considerations of power politics and British survival. Lord Lothian, then British ambassador to the United States, said in March of 1938, at the time of the Austrian crisis, he said the following: "If another war comes, and the history of it is ever written, the dispassionate historian 100 years hence will say not that Germany alone was responsible for it, even if she strikes first, but that those who mismanaged the world between 1918 and 1937 had a large share of responsibility in it." That was the British ambassador to America before war even broke out. Now, that's 1938. We have now 1996. That means that almost 100 years are up, and all kinds of historians are delving into the archives, and they're coming exactly to these conclusions. Well, right now they are still being hunted and hounded, like the British historian David Irving, the German historian Diewald, people like myself. You know, we have our houses torched and are being jailed, and have our postal accounts, checking accounts and so on being seized because we write these uncomfortable truths. But here is the British ambassador, Lord Lothian, to the United States in March 1938, before a shot had been fired, saying that if another war comes, and the history of it is ever written, the dispassionate historian 100 years hence will say not that Germany alone was responsible for it, even if she strikes first, but that those who mismanaged the world between 1918 and 1937 had a large share of responsibility in it. Now remember, the operative term here is dispassionate. None of these Jewish writers and promoters of the Jewish viewpoint on history qualify. They're not dispassionate. They're one-sided to the core. And so, don't look for the Finkelsteins and Pimplehoopers and Cohens and what's his name, Goldhagens, for any truths. There is more to truth than just the Jewish side, let me show you. And you are hearing not the German side, but you are hearing a balanced viewpoint that I'm quoting to you from allied sources, so that you can make up your own mind. In his column, April 23rd, 1944, Karl von Wiegand wrote, I quote, "On April 1939, 4 months before Hitler invaded Poland, Ambassador William C. Bullitt, whom I had known for 20 years, called me to the American embassy in Paris. Both of us, standing before the fireplace in his office, the windows of which faced the beautiful Place de la Concorde, the American ambassador told me that war had been decided upon. He did not say, nor did I ask by whom. He let me infer it. When I said that in the end Germany would be driven into the arms of Soviet Russia and Bolshevism, the ambassador replied, 'What of it? There will not be enough Germans left when the war is over to be worth Bolshevizing.'" Let me repeat that. I was 5 years old when that conversation took place. It was the day before my birthday. April the 23rd, 1945, famous American writer Karl von Wiegand wrote, on April 1939, 4 months before Hitler invaded Poland. 4 months before Hitler invaded Poland, the American ambassador already knew that war had been decided. Let me quote you his callous statement. In his column, April 23, 1945, Carl von Wiegand wrote, quote, on April 1939, 4 months before Hitler invaded Poland, Ambassador William C. Bullitt, whom I had known for 20 years, called me to the American embassy in Paris, both of us standing before the fireplace in his office, the windows of which faced the beautiful Place de la Concorde. The American ambassador told me that war had been decided upon. He did not say, nor did I ask, by whom. He let me infer it. When I said that in the end Germany would be driven into the arms of Soviet Russia and Bolshevism, the ambassador replied, what of it? There will not be enough Germans left when the war is over to be worth Bolshevizing. End of quote. That's what I say to you about American power politics coupled with British power politics coupled with Jewish interest. Let me refresh your memory. James Forrestal, quoting Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England. He says, in 27th December 1945, I played golf with Joe Kennedy today, the father of John F. Kennedy. And he said that Chamberlain's position in 1938 was that England had much to fight with and she would not risk going to war with Hitler. In Kennedy's view, that Hitler would have fought Russia without any later conflict with England if it had not been for Bullets, that same Bullets, William C. Bullitt, then ambassador to France, urging on Roosevelt in the summer of 1939 that the Germans must be faced down about Poland. Neither the French nor the British would have made Poland a cause of war. If it had not been for the constant needling from Washington, Bullitt, he said, kept telling Roosevelt that the Germans would not fight. Kennedy said that they would, and that they would overrun Europe. Chamberlain, the Premier of England, Prime Minister of England, he says, stated that America and the world's Jews had forced England into the war. Now, here is Carl von Wiegand saying that very same Bullitt told him on April 1939, 4 months before the war started, that war had been decided upon. And then he said that he wouldn't say who, by whom, but he said, when it is said that in the end Germany would be driven into the arms of Soviet Russia and Bolshevik, the ambassador replied, what of it? There will not be enough Germans left when the war is over to be worth Bolshevizing. Not a shot had been fired in anger in Europe. The American ambassador in Paris, talking to a famous American journalist, already says, knowing the slaughter that would take place in Europe, that there won't be enough Germans there to Bolshevize. Those Germans were people of flesh and blood. My father, my mother, my sisters, my uncles. 100 million German people, along with 250 million Russians, Poles, Romanians, absolutely meant nothing. The suffering that was going to come meant nothing. And these people died in their beds peacefully. Should they not have been strung up as warmongers and war criminals? I ask you in all honesty, 4 months before the war starts, 4 months before the first shot is fired, this American ambassador says, so what? There will not be enough Germans left when the war is over to be worth Bolshevizing. A month earlier, according to the Associated Press, Joseph Stalin, in one of his most outspoken statements, told the world that Soviet Russia would not be dragged into a conflict with Germany as a cat's paw to pull British and French chestnuts out of the fire. Underlying the policy of non-intervention against fascism, he said, was a desire to embroil Italy, Japan, and Germany as deeply as possible in a war against the Soviet Union, and then, when they all had become weakened by conflict, come on the stage with fresh forces and dictate the peace. This is exactly what Stalin fell into after. So how much was Stalin his own man? Who knows? Was Ehrenburg his Jewish propaganda? Was Wyszynski? Were all these other Jewish high-ranking Bolsheviks behind him? More Kaganovich, his Minister of Industries, War Production, the man in charge of the Soviet State Bank. Were they more powerful? Was Stalin also only a puppet? Because certainly when you hear him say that Joseph Stalin, in one of his most outspoken statements, told the world that Soviet Russia would not be dragged into a conflict with Germany as a cat's paw to pull British and French chestnuts out of the fire. Underlying the policy of non-intervention against fascism, he said, was a desire to embroil Italy, Japan, and Germany as deeply as possible in a war against the Soviet Union, and then, when they all had become weakened by conflict, come on the stage with fresh forces and dictate the peace. He outsmarted his allies in the end, because President Roosevelt, befuddled and weakened by illness and by God knows what, allowed Stalin and his communists that had infiltrated the American government to dictate the peace policy which we have inherited in history, known as the Yalta and Potsdam agreements, with all the disasters that they brought for Europe and the world. We have outlined those in previous shows. No need to go back into here again. A month after the conflict started, Pravda said, peace and friendship between the USSR and Germany are also in the interests of all nations of Europe. Conditions of anxiety, enmity, and mutual distrust in Eastern Europe are advantageous only for warmongers who are used to make others pull chestnuts out of the fire for them. Such conditions were maintained in the course of many years by a policy of incitement of one country against the other. Now, that's still Pravda talking, the mouthpiece of Joseph Stalin. But what happened? Before Hitler struck, a huge armada of 220 Soviet divisions were pulled together in absolute top-notch war preparation to attack Germany. And more historians in Europe are now admitting that what Hitler did was strike, a preemptive strike at the heart of Stalin's plan, which by that time either had changed or all along he was talking out of both corners of his mouth. Professor Harry Elmer Barnes, in reply to the charge of bellicosity of the German people, says the following: England has been a way out in front in point of relative bellicosity amongst the nations, while Germany and the Netherlands stand at the very bottom of the list next to Denmark. This conclusion is forced by such findings as those in Professor Quincy Wright's A Study of War, wherein it is shown that in the period from 1480 to 1940, there were 278 wars involving European countries, whose percentage participation was as follows: England, 28% of all the wars fought in Europe; France, 26%, Spain, 23%, Russia, 22%, Austria, 19%, Turkey, 15%, Poland, 11%, Sweden, 9%, Italy, 9%, Netherlands, 8%, Germany, including Prussia, 8%, and Denmark, 7%. You can find that in Volume 1, page 221 of Quincy Wright's A Study of War from 1480 to 1940. So the Germans and Denmark share the last place, and that includes Prussia. So what is this bull that these people like this man in here, the Jewish writer Theodor Nathan Kaufmann, talks about Germany's war lust and lust for world conquest and death to Germany and so on. England, France, Spain, Russia, Austria, Turkey, Poland, Sweden, Italy, Netherlands, all fought more wars in the 500 years preceding the Second World War than Germany. So, if you have a record like that over 500 years, what is one war? Is it because it only counts that it is the last war? Likewise, Pitry-Rim Sorokin, in Volume 3, Part 2 of his Social and Cultural Dynamics, shows that from the 12th century to 1925, the percentage of years in which leading European powers have been at war is as follows. He says that on page 352. Spain, 67 years at war since the year 1200, the 12th century. Spain, 67 years at war. Poland, Poland forever the victim, 58 years at war. England, 56 years. France, 50 years. Russia, 46 years. Holland, 44 years. Italy, 36 years. Germany, 28 years. 28 years. Less than half of what Spain was at war. And just about half of what England was at war. So what is this idea of pinning on the Germans, this war lust? It only exists in the figment of the feverish brains of hate mongers and anti-German bigots. That's where it rests. In history books, the Germans don't look too bad at all. Sorokin concludes, therefore, that Germany has had the smallest, in Spain the largest percent of years at war. Of leading modern European states, England, France, and Russia thus show nearly twice the bellicosity displayed by the war-loving Germans. Professor Barnes goes on to say, President Truman has well said that constructive public acts must be based on truth. It is too bad somebody could not have whispered the little truth into his ear before he left for Potsdam. There is little prospect of a structure erected wholly on lies in 1945 will endure any better than the one that was wholly based on lies in 1919. And that is exactly what happened. Adolf Hitler came and ripped that Treaty of Versailles apart as if it was a bunch of toilet paper. And I guarantee you, one day, a German, if not by war, then at least through thought and spirit and truth, will rip Potsdam and Yalta to shreds because they were as unfair and moored in hatred and planned, I have to say it, by Jews like Henry Morgenthau and by people like Nathan Theodore Kaufman. Why should other nations, why should American Gentiles and Christians take the responsibility for the brains, the feverish, sick brains of people like Theodor Kaufmann, who wanted to wipe out the entire German nation, and Henry Morgenthau? It would be intellectually dishonest not to pin the blame where the blame belongs to be pinned. And the probability is that the disillusionment after Potsdam will set in much more rapidly than it did after Versailles. In the period after 1919, we had to wait some years to obtain formally secret documents to upset the lies of the period of war and peacemaking. This time, the upsetting facts are already available and so clear that any honest and informed man can read them whole while running. The only thing that we have to wait for is courage, courage enough to state what is today well known and above serious doubt. In short, to know that an honest historian will not be listed immediately as a defendant in a mass sedition trial. You see, terror against the historians in America, England, and the Western countries, like in the Soviet Union, and still in Germany today, where people like myself are already rotting in jail because we say and tell these uncomfortable truths. And so here is what Elmer Barnes, Professor Harry Elmer Barnes, great American historian, researcher, and the father of modern historical revisionism, said that if the historians could do his job without being threatened by court cases, the truth was already known in 1945, 46, and 47. Nuremberg was concocted in order to prevent a truthful unraveling of history. Believe me, incitement to war is a terrible thing. Oliver Littleton, British Minister of Production, told the Chamber of Commerce of America in London, June 20th, 1944, as reported by the United Press, Japan was provoked into attacking the United States at Pearl Harbor. It is a travesty on history ever to say that America was forced into the war. Imagine that. He was British Minister of Production, and he told already the Chamber of Commerce of America in London, June 20th, 1944, in the middle of the war, that Japan was provoked into attacking the United States at Pearl Harbor. It is a travesty on history ever to say that America was forced into the war. It is now established that to try to avoid war with the United States, Germany ordered its submarines not to retaliate in any way when attacked by U.S. forces under orders from Washington. In clear violation of international law, our vessels in the Atlantic were ordered 2 months before Pearl Harbor to shell all Axis craft encountered. At the time, Admiral Stark had sent a message to Admiral Kimmel that we are at war in the Atlantic. 2 months after Pearl Harbor, Prime Minister Winston Churchill told the House of Commons, "When I survey and compute the powers of the United States and its vast resources and feel that they are now in with us, with the British Commonwealth of Nations, altogether, however long it lasts, till death or victory, I cannot believe that there is any other fact in the whole world which can compare with that. That is what I had dreamed of, aimed at, and worked for, and now it has come to pass." Balance of power. People be damned, lives be ruined, made no difference to these plutocrats in Washington, the Bolsheviks in Russia, and these oligarchy in England. They wanted to retain power at all costs. Hitler was a threat, not to the Jews, to them. And that's why Germany nearly had to die. We are nearing the end of this long series, which I think just had to be done, because the German viewpoint must be heard, and it's long overdue. And so we return to Gruesome Harvest, this American book, only 135 pages, plus all the many, many footnotes. A treasure, a treasure. If you want to bring order to your troubled mind, what happened during the war and to the aftermath, let me tell you, this book has it. And I return just briefly to a quote in which, on page 125, the famous American writer Carl von Wiegand, on April the 23rd, 1944, writes that he was summoned to Ambassador William C. Bullitt's embassy, the American embassy in France, on April 1939, and he was said, war had been decided upon. The ambassador said, war had been decided upon. Remember, that was 4 months before a shot was fired in Europe. And when the writer protested that this would drive the Germans into the arms of Soviet Russia, the American ambassador, 4 months before the war broke out, said, what of it? There will not be enough Germans left when the war is over to be worth Bolshevizing. And so we return to page 127, which talks about Allied policies and how Winston Churchill says that he cannot believe that now that the United States is in the war, he said, I cannot believe that there is any other fact in the whole world which can compare with that. That is what I dreamt of, aimed at, and worked for, and now it has come to pass, meaning the war between America, England, and the Western Allies, Germany, and the Soviet Union. Our Lend-Lease program had been squeezed through Congress by the narrowest of margins. As a peace measure, Senator Glass had given away its real purpose, however, when he said he favored loaning Great Britain all the war equipment we could spare to wipe Germany off the face of the map. Senator Glass, remember, had given away his real purpose when he said he favored loaning Great Britain all the war equipment we could spare to wipe Germany off the face of the map. It just happens to be that Senator Glass is another one of the brethren of Nathan Theodore Kaufman and Henry Morgenthau. It is always that kind of thinking. At least Glass had the courage to say what was on his mind. and on the mind of many, a figure in Washington and elsewhere. Hitler has been condemned as a violator of international pacts and agreements. Yet when we sent destroyers to Britain long before Pearl Harbor and later on permitted many of our vessels to be commandeered by British officers, we violated Section 3 of Article 5 of the Act of June 15, 1917, which provides that during a war in which the United States is a neutral nation, it shall be unlawful to send out of the jurisdiction of the United States any vessel built, armed, or equipped as a vessel of war, with any intent or with reasonable cause to believe that it shall be used by any belligerent nation. We also violated the Hague Convention, which forbids a neutral nation to supply any war material whatever to any belligerent country. There is no need to pursue the argument further. We have shown that good grounds exist for doubting, in some degree at least, the charge that the German people, because of their perverse natures in their will and lust for war, were the sole culprits in the late conflict. There is equal room, therefore, for doubting the justice of the Potsdam program to cripple the Germany and condemn its people to perpetual poverty, and equally sound moral grounds for the repudiation of that program in Potsdam. Now let's turn to collective guilt and war propaganda. The victors in every war think they are right, and the defeated wrong. The late war has offered no exception. By continuing to condemn the defeated in this war as a race of criminals and punishing them accordingly, as we at first set out to do, we would be setting a most dangerous precedent, one which our children might have good reason to regret. For if we should ever lose a war, we could only expect similar treatment. Remember what I've said in previous programs. We Germans will remember. It's not a threat. It's a statement that comes from the bottom of the heart of every German. The indignities that you have allowed the conquerors of Germany, the real conquerors of Germany, not your GIs, the real conquerors of Germany, to heap upon the German nation for the last 50 years is so utterly disgusting that I do not want you to think that you can inflict that kind of psychic trauma and damage on the reputation of an entire nation, that one day it will not come back to you and you will rue the day, believe me, when karma will be done. It is manifestly unjust to blame and punish the people of any country for the acts of their leaders, especially where the people have been brought under the heel of a dictatorship, which under heavy penalty compels conformity to the leaders, edicts and orders. The truth is that the people of no nation in modern history, including ourselves, have ever enjoyed an important voice in the making of the great decisions, either of going to war or of framing the peace agreements. This is one of the greatest facts we must face. America cannot possibly add amelioration to the sordid game of power politics which has plunged the nations of the world into one terrible war after another, until the people do assert themselves and insist upon the injection of justice into the peace arrangements. But before this can be accomplished, they must break the bonds of false propaganda. This propaganda flows from two major levels, a higher and a lower. Britons pose as upholder of righteousness while actually engaged in manipulating the balance of power system exemplifies the upper level. This type of propaganda is poignantly described by the late John Maynard Keynes in The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he says the following: the politics of power are inevitable, and there is nothing very new to learn about this war or the end of it. What was fought for England had destroyed, as in each preceding century, a trade rival. A mighty chapter had been closed in the secular struggle between the glories of Germany and France. Prudence required some measure of lip service to the ideals of foolish Americans and hypocritical Englishmen, but it would be stupid to believe that there is much room in the world, as it really is, for such affairs as the League of Nations or any sense in the principle of self-determination, except as an ingenious formula for rearranging balance of power in one's own interest. I like this line. Prudence required some measure of lip service to the ideals of foolish Americans and hypocritical Englishmen. That's John Maynard Keynes in The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Yeah. Prudence required some measure of lip service to the ideals of foolish Americans and hypocritical Englishmen. This was written about World War I, but it applies as well to the Second. Another Englishman, the great Disraeli, Jewish background, said, all great events have been distorted, most of the important causes concealed, some of the principal characters never appear, and all who figure are so misunderstood and misrepresented that the result is a complete mystification. If the history of England is ever written by one who has the knowledge and the courage, the world would be astonished. Only a Jew like Disraeli could say it, because obviously he knew a great deal about it. Let me read it to you again and then apply it to the Holocaust, or to Adolf Hitler, or to National Socialist Germany. Disraeli. All great events have been distorted, most of the important causes concealed, some of the principal characters never appear, and all who figure are so misunderstood and misrepresented that the result is complete mystification. If the history of England is ever written by one who has the knowledge and the courage, the world would be astonished. Do you understand how important it is to revise history, to keep digging, scratching, searching libraries, documents, first-hand accounts of survivors, diaries, and so on, and not to allow the mouthpieces, the propagandists of the powerful, to tell only their version, because, as Disraeli said, that it would leave nothing but to complete mystification. British Foreign Minister Ernst Bevin told the truth about the propaganda of the lower level when he said at the London Conference of Foreign Ministers, February 10, 1946, "A newspaper has three things to do. One is to amuse, another is to entertain, and the rest is to mislead." Now, let me tell you, look at every single newspaper that you see today, what is referred to in England as the bum and titty press. And what you have is, a newspaper has three things to do. One is to amuse, that's why you get all these weird stories, and you get the center spread of the near-naked girls. One other one is to entertain, and the rest is to mislead. There you go. That such propaganda has played an enormous part in the fomenting most wars cannot be doubted. It deceives and bewilders the public, inflaming it and strengthening its innate prejudices, which civilizing processes ordinarily hold to tolerable proportions. People can accurately judge only those things which come within the purview of their direct experience, or which they are allowed to view from all angles by educational processes. When the medium upon which the people rely to bring them their foreign news color and emasculate the facts, or even manufacture them out of whole cloth, as they sometimes do, there is no possibility for the public to get the truth. Its collective judgment, the accuracy of which is the base upon which the democratic processes rest, cannot in consequence be reliable. On the contrary, if its judgment is misled and its passion inflamed properly for the purpose, it will inevitably support mad adventures, unjust interventions, and other tragic missteps in international affairs. Remember the hullabaloo, how Desert Storm was created out of nothing? Remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution? Remember this Pearl Harbor attack, which the British clearly knew the Americans were manipulating the Japanese into attacking? And Bullitt already knew 4 months before the war that war had been decided upon by the powers that had the means to do it. Not little people, not the British Tommy, the German Lancer, or the French Poilu. They just did the dying, the suffering, the fighting. They gave their eyes, their limbs, their legs, their arms, their health, their lives. Thus, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, a month before war broke out, sadly observed, "Unhappily, bad feeling between nations is fomented daily by poisonous propaganda in the press and by other means. I cannot help feeling that if only we halt this war of words and some action is taken which would tend to restore confidence of the people in the peaceful institutions and intentions of all the statesmen of Europe, if only that could be done, then I still feel that I know of no question that could not and should not be solved by peaceful discussions. The gain would be enormous. On the other hand, if war should come, whichever side may claim ultimate victory, nothing is more certain than that the victor and vanquished alike would glean a gruesome harvest of human misery and suffering." This is why this book is called Gruesome Harvest, from which I'm quoting you. What an eloquent statement by Neville Chamberlain, much reviled, much reviled. He so hoped to bring peace in our time. And obviously, he knew that there were these forces whipping up the public. How this man must have gone to his grave. Americans as well as the British were flooded with misleading, inflammatory propaganda on the eve of the war. Only a few calm, informed observers were able apparently to see through it. In the letter to Hugh W. Long and Company, an executive of Roosevelt and Sons of Pine Street, wrote 6 months before we were plunged into the war the following: "I cannot refrain from expressing my contempt for those who are politically toying with a fear motive at this time and painting a picture of the United States overrun by Adolf Hitler. There never was a country so strongly situated strategically for defense as this one. And when in addition, that country has more oil than any other country in the world and more practical inventive achievement to its credit, including the original invention of and most of the significant improvements upon the airplane, and has an established and recognized aptitude for mass production, it is clear to me that it has a special genius for mechanized warfare, and that all talk about what Adolf Hitler's armed forces may do to us is just bunk. Just bunk. No, if totalitarianism is coming to the United States, it will come because the American people can be charmed by insincere, superficial, adroit politicians and fail to demand the leadership of men of character, of courage, and honesty." Nobody could have put it more eloquently. Perhaps the most poisonous of all the propaganda themes circulated in this country in full-page newspaper ads and elsewhere was the purported statement of Adolf Hitler that he was going to come over here someday and finish off decadent Yankeedom. The passage was dressed up to look like a direct quotation and was placed over the name of Adolf Hitler. Every effort was made to give the impression that it came from Mein Kampf, whereas it was something Hermann Rauschnig had said, Hitler had said, the unsupported testimony of one man, a refugee and we should add here, a discredited man by history, Rauschnig. He said that Hitler would come over here and finish off Yankeedom. Hitler never said it. Such a proposition is quite at variance with what Hitler actually wrote in Mein Kampf, where he decries Germany's vulnerability on account of her exposed borders and the small extent of her national territory, and extols the United States on account of its vast space, which is equivalent to the size of a continent, and its incomparable inner strength. The gigantic North American shore, he says, quote, with the enormous resources of its soil, is much more invulnerable than the encircled German Reich. End of quote. And again he says, military decisions are more quickly, more easily, more completely, and more effectively gained against states which have extensive territories. Moreover, the magnitude of a national territory is of itself a certain assurance that an outside power will not hastily risk the adventure of an invasion. For in that case, the struggle for power would have to be long and exhausting before victory would be hoped for. The risk being so great, there would have to be extraordinary reasons for such an aggressive adventure. Hence, it is that the territorial magnitude of a state furnishes a basis whereon national liberty and independence can be maintained with relative ease. Does that sound to you like an Adolf Hitler that was chewing carpets, climbing walls, having girls defecate and urinate in his face to get his jollies? Or does that sound to you like a man of an absolute sound mind who understood America very clearly and obviously in his calculations would not later forget the power of this America? Yet Bullitt knew war had been decided upon 4 months before Adolf Hitler ever gave any orders for anything. Yet how firmly propaganda had fixed the public impression that Mein Kampf offered a program for world conquest is brought out in the following excerpt taken from the transcript of the question period following an address given by Ambassador John Cudahy before the Chicago Council of Foreign Relations a month and a half before Pearl Harbor. Chairman Bentley, I have a question here in writing. How do you reconcile Hitler's announced plan of world conquest with his statements made to you? Mr. Cudahy, I know of no plan of world conquest. Cries of, how about Mein Kampf from the audience? I read Mein Kampf very thoroughly, and I cannot find any plan for world conquest. Cries of, oh, from the audience. It used to put me to sleep, but after I had been in Germany, I read the thing very thoroughly. Hitler has made a number of statements that would indicate that he has dreamt of world empire, but I guess Hitler can be guilty of a bit of campaign oratory. I know that this war was caused by the last war. You see, if every politician in America, England, Canada, and so on was kept to his campaign promises, and if they were as magnified and blown out of proportion of statements Hitler allegedly made, many of those people ought to be dangling from trees. There never was any actual evidence that world conquest was contemplated. General Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, in his biannual report released in October 1945, stated that valuation by the War Department General Staff of interrogations of ranking members of the German High Command had failed to disclose any overall German strategic plan to conquer the world. That's the way it was. The range of German planes hardly reached England. They never reached the production centers in the Ural Mountains. How could anybody in their sane mind believe that Adolf Hitler could invade the United States? Technologically, at that time, in that period, impossible. Now, the conclusion of this book. The Allied program to re-educate the Germans is a case of one deluded group trying to disillusion another. Our conviction that the Germans have been filled with poisonous propaganda is quite correct, and our impulse to extirpate the effects of that propaganda is a good one. However, we cannot accomplish our purpose when so many of our own ideas are false, and especially when the Germans know from direct experience that they are false. To be successful, a teacher must enjoy the respect of those he attempts to teach. He must win that respect through the demonstrated superiority of his knowledge and understanding. Part of what we are trying to teach the Germans is true and could have most salutary effect on the German outlook. If only we could get the Germans to listen with respect and sympathy. But too much of what we try to make them believe, the Germans know to be untrue. And this knowledge on their part causes them to lose their respect for us and to turn a deaf ear to everything we say. Our re-education program should begin at home. If we could only overcome the effects of our own illusions, born of propaganda and ignorance, arising from lack of intimate knowledge of European affairs, if we could only possess ourselves of the facts and then face them courageously, we not only could re-educate the Germans, but could eliminate many erroneous and strategically and tragically dangerous features of our German program. Unless we do revise our own ideas and the program to which those ideas have given birth, we are in danger of losing Germany, Europe, and everything for which we fought this costly war. It is hoped that this book will help point the way to truth and therefore to our future success. Our experience in Europe has already taught us some bitter lessons and has forced us to ameliorate in some degree the harsh and brutal program which we set about to force upon our defeated enemy. But we have much more to learn and must make many more changes in our own policy before we can hope for the success of our German adventure. But this is the key operating term on this conclusion to this booklet, is that if we only possess ourselves of the facts and then face them courageously, and if we only overcome the effects of our own illusions born of propaganda and ignorance, arising from lack of intimate knowledge of European affairs, that would be a good beginning. And let me tell you, this is what the problem was. Moralizing instead of morality, and arrogant ignorance, coupled with a total lack of understanding, made America and many of its policymakers the saps, being basically manipulated by people like Stalin and his henchmen, those who were behind him. That's the tragedy of the Second World War. That's the reason why I made this long series of programs. It comes as a reaction to a number of books that have been released. One of these here is Germany Must Perish. Then this one here, An Eye for an Eye by John Sack, that told of the untold story of Jewish revenge against Germans in 1945. Also, the revelations contained in this book are The Losses by the Canadian author James Buck, who talks about the murder of between 1 and 2 million German soldiers and civilians in Eisenhower's death camps, which was in Canada certainly a very large story, dominating the kind of intellectual circles for quite some time. Saturday Night Magazine is Canada's premier intellectual magazine. It devoted a long, but virtually the whole magazine to this story here. And the author, James Buck, has, of course, since published another book, Good Crimes and Mercy, in which he claims that because of a deliberate Allied policy, the German nation lost between 9 and 10 million people after the war was over. In other words, once the shooting stopped. And this we have to put into the context of what this book, Germany Must Perish, had advocated. And I just read it to you with one sentence. This dynamic volume outlines a comprehensive plan for the extinction of the German nation and the total eradication from the earth of all her people. Now, of course, people will say that the Germans had it coming to them, and the Germans are responsible for their own misfortune. And I just want to quickly turn to an American book. The writer of the book was none other than the former Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal. On page 121, he quotes a diary entry that he played golf with Joe Kennedy, the father of President Kennedy, today, on the 27th of December 1945, and that he asked Kennedy what he thought Chamberlain's ideas were and plans were in 1938. And the father of President Kennedy's view as the ambassador to London then was that Hitler would have fought Russia without any later conflict with England if it had not been for the constant urging on of William C. Bullitt, then ambassador to France, who urged on Roosevelt in the summer of 1939 that the Germans must be faced down over Poland. And he says that Chamberlain said neither the French nor the British would have made Poland a cause for war if it had not been for the constant needling from Washington. Bullitt, he said, kept telling Roosevelt that the Germans would not fight, Kennedy that they would, and that they would overrun Europe. And then Prime Minister Chamberlain of England, he says, stated that America and the world's Jews had forced England into the war. So we have the father of President Kennedy speaking to this famous American political leader and Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, saying that the world's Jews were behind the war. And of course, what we also have is admissions in this book called Gruesome Harvest. And it is that there was war decided already. That war had already been decided on. It's on page 125 in this book, Gruesome Harvest, an American book published in 1947, in which the writer says that the Lord Lothian, the then British ambassador to the United States, said in March 1938, which was about half a year before hostilities really got going, he said the following: if another war comes, and the history of it is ever written, the dispassionate historian 100 years hence will say not that Germany alone was responsible for it, even if she strikes first, but that those who mismanaged the world between 1918 and 1937 had a large share of responsibility in it. Now, since that time, 60 years have gone into the land, and of course, the British ambassador to the United States could not know then how powerful the basically Holocaust or Jewish lobby would be in the world, in the post-war world. But what he says here is important to remember, that the dispassionate historian would give the Germans a much fairer shake than the propagandists who have since appeared with books, the kind of court historians like Martin Gilbert and William Shearer and so on. One thing that we should remember before people are so quick to pin the blame for all that befell the world on the Germans and on Adolf Hitler's government, in what Karl von Wiegand wrote in his column April the 23rd, 1944, in which he reports having a meeting 4 months before Hitler invaded Poland with the ambassador of the United States to France, William C. Bullitt, that we mentioned here in the Forrestal diaries, who was, according to the father of President Kennedy, a warmonger who kept misinforming Roosevelt that the Germans would not fight over Poland. And so William Bullitt meets this American writer, Karl von Wiegand, and he says, this is how Wiegand remembers it: on April 1939, 4 months before Hitler invaded Poland, Ambassador William C. Bullitt, whom I had known for 20 years, called me to the American embassy in Paris, both of us standing before the fireplace in his office, the windows of which faced the beautiful Place de la Concorde. The American ambassador told me that war had been decided upon. 4 months before the war broke out, the American ambassador to France, William C. Bullitt, knew that war had been decided upon. By whom? By whom? Since he is an American, ambassador had the ear of President Roosevelt, chances are that he must have known who in America and who were the forces behind Roosevelt who had decided that war would come. Because, as Forrestal says, not even the British Prime Minister at that time, Neville Chamberlain, much vilified, laughed at with his umbrella and peace in our time slogan. He did not want war. Obviously, he was a decent and honorable man, and he was eclipsed by warmongers like Roosevelt and in America, and warmongers like Churchill in England. And of course, by now today, we know that Churchill had made some very bad gambling debts and played the stock market and had kind of bought on margin, and some friendly Jewish financiers, I think one of them is called Strakosch, a Czech Jew, came to his rescue, and apparently Bernard Baruch also. So he was in the pocket of this advisor to presidents, who obviously also was an advisor to President Roosevelt. He had been in charge of the war production board in the First World War already. He had asked for some stupendous German reparations to be paid after the First World War, when Hitler was an unknown. In other words, Bernard Baruch had a hatred of Germans that can only be considered when one checks into his tribal background. And so he, Baruch, Morgenthau, they were already waiting in the wings together with Roosevelt and his coterie of advisors. One of them, I'm given to understand, a friend of his speechwriter. Then here was Theodor Nathan Kaufmann, the man who wanted to eradicate the German nation. Is it any surprise then that the Morgenthau plan is evolved in the United States, and that Tehran and Yalta and Potsdam agreements are made that are absolutely favorable to Marxism, devastating to Europe and Western civilization and to freedom on the continent? Basically, America went to war to make the world safe for communism. As simple as that. It might sound shocking to Americans, but it was American intervention, American materiel, American lend-lease that was sent to save Stalin's hide. The Germans, to all intents and purposes, had defeated the evil empire, as President Reagan would call it 50 years later. My father was picking up the wounded German soldiers from the battlefields of Stalingrad and of Moscow. The Germans were on the outskirts of Moscow already when the terror bombing campaign began to wipe out German war production plants and German civilians. When 58,000 people in Hamburg were bombed into death, mostly women and children. So this was the turning point, Stalingrad. From that moment on, when American help for the Soviets began to arrive in huge numbers, when 500,000 trucks and 10,000 ship engines and enough uniforms to equip armies of millions of men, enough copper wires to go around the earth apparently 18 times, and so on. And even a shag pipe for Joe Stalin were delivered to the Soviet Union. American help, American lend-lease made the world safe, not for democracy, but for one of the worst despotisms that, believe me, for anyone in Europe that knew the situation in Europe, was far worse than Adolf Hitler's regime ever was. Now, in previous programs and previous series, we have looked at the alleged Holocaust against the Jews, and we will so again in the future. Let me just say that Carl von Wiegand reports the American ambassador, a friend of his for 20 years, saying that 4 months before the first shot was fired in anger, that war had been decided upon. Hitler's fault? Hitler's fault? It was before the invasion of Poland, where the Poles were murdering Germans by the thousands, ethnic Germans that they held illegally, contrary to the promises of the Versailles Treaty and so on. So, the forces behind Roosevelt and whoever they were in the world had decided against a war against Adolf Hitler. So let's not be so hasty and blame all the tragedy on the Germans. Then also, of course, we have studied for this series, The Bellicosity of the Germans. And we have quoted Harry Elmer Barnes, who says, England has been a way out in front in point of relative bellicosity among the nations, while Germany and the Netherlands stand at the very bottom of the list next to Denmark. And that in the 500 years that Quincy writes in his book, A Study of War, examined from 1480 to 1940, there were 278 wars involving European countries, and again Germany, including Prussia, were at the end of it. And that the number of countries who were at war for what number of years, that's Pitrim Sorokin in Volume 3, Part 2 of his book, Social and Cultural Dynamics, says that if you go all the way back from the 12th century to 1925, you will find that of all the countries in Europe involved in wars, Spain led Europe, Poland 58, England 56 years at war, France 50 years, Russia 46 years, Holland 44 years, Italy 36 years, Germany from the 12th century to 1925 was at war exactly 28 years, which is less than half of what Spain was and about half of what England was. And then Professor Barnes, the father of American revisionism, goes on and basically excoriates the President of the United States and says that President Truman has well said that constructive public acts must be based on truth. It's too bad somebody could not have whispered a little truth into his ear before he left for Potsdam. There is little prospect that a structure erected wholly on lies in 1945 will endure any better than the one that was wholly based on lies in 1919. So here is the Dean of American Revisionist Historian Professors already saying in 1945 and 6 that Potsdam was as much based on lies as the Versailles Treaty. And he says that, and the probability is that the disillusionment after Potsdam will set in much more rapidly than it did after Versailles. In the period after 1919, we had to wait some years to obtain formally secret documents to upset the lies of the period of war and peacemaking. This time the upsetting facts are already available and so clear that honest and informed men can read them while running. The only thing that we have to wait for is courage enough to state today what is today well known and above serious doubt, in short, to know that an honest historian will not be listed immediately as a defendant in a mass sedition trial. Well, that's exactly what happened, and is still hanging on to this day. In Germany, historians have their cars firebombed, their houses firebombed and smeared at. They are jailed, arrested, charged, convicted by the current German state if they question the Allied version of history. And that's now over 50 years ago. The German Quislings are still dragging their historians, in pillorying them. In France, it is the same. In America, people like James Back in Canada and in America, of course, since he's talking about Dwight Eisenhower's death camps, are experiencing the same kind of repression. They are vilified and silenced. They've been given the silent treatment. Now, Barnes couldn't know that in the free America this could take place, but it is taking place. And Prime Minister Churchill, speaking in the House of Commons, admitted that he had worked all his life for this conflagration. He said, I cannot believe that there is any fact in the whole world which can compare with the fact that now that America has joined the British Commonwealth of Nations against the Germans. That is what I dreamed of, aimed at, and worked for, and now it has come to pass. And so the writer here discusses briefly the Lend-Lease program had been squeezed through Congress by the narrowest of margins as a peace measure. Senator Glass, a Jewish senator, had given away its real purpose, however, when he said he favored loaning Great Britain all the war equipment we could spare to wipe Germany off the face of the map. He had the courage to say what was on his mind of many as a figure in Washington and elsewhere. And so Hitler has been condemned as a violator of international pacts and agreements, yet when we sent destroyers to Britain long before Pearl Harbor and later on permitted many of our vessels to be commandeered by British officers, we violated Section 3 of Article 5 of the Act of June 15, 1917, which provides that during a war in which the United States is a neutral nation, it shall be unlawful to send out of the jurisdiction of the United States any vessel built, armed, or equipped as a vessel of war with any intent or with reasonable cause to believe that it shall be used by any belligerent nation. And we also violated the Hague Convention, which forbids a neutral nation to supply any war materials whatever to any belligerent country. And he says there is no need to pursue the argument. We have shown that the good grounds exist for doubting in some degree, at least, the charge that the German people, because of their perverse natures and their will and lust for war, were the sole culprits in the late conflict. Well, if the American ambassador 4 months before the war started already knew that a war was coming, then the Germans are hardly to blame, because these Germans had nothing to do with that. And we then go and we looked at this here. Disraeli, the British Prime Minister under Queen Victoria, he said, all great events have been distorted, most of the important causes concealed, some of the principal characters never appear, and all who figure are so misunderstood and misrepresented that the result is a complete mystification. If the history of England is ever written by one who has the knowledge and the courage, the world would be astonished. You can say the absolute same about Adolf Hitler, the Holocaust, the German High Command, the Nuremberg war crimes trials, and so on. The history of Europe has not been written properly. It has only been Allied propaganda posing as history. And so the world would be astonished if they could ever get a glimpse at a totally unfettered history. And hopefully, people like myself will find enough resonance out there in radio and TV land to find these people so that we can finally deliver to the world a state of the world message, unfettered and not purposely mystified, as Disraeli said. And then we'll just quote the British Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin after the war, who said that propaganda of the lower level, when he said at the London Conference of Foreign Ministers, February 10th, 1946, a newspaper has 3 things to do. One is to amuse, another is to entertain, and the rest is to mislead. And I claim that the Allied world, when it comes to things German, has been exactly guilty of that. And we have discussed at great length the idea of balance of power, and how this balance of power by banksters, meaning bankers and gangsters in high places, have been the death knell of many a country and even civilizations. And so it just upsets me when I think how many good people died, how much European history could have been different, how much European culture was sent back, and how many people died needlessly and painfully, how many people lost their lives, their wives, sweethearts, children, their valued possessions, how many great paintings, how many great churches, edifices, cities were wiped out in this insane, murderous campaign because of this balance of power thinking in the Allied world against the Germans. And they say in the balance of power, already in articles written in 1943, it makes no difference if the leader in Germany would be a Nazi or communist or socialist. After all, the First World War was fought just as murderously for that very same policy against a Kaiser who had nothing but Jews surrounding him. So it wasn't Hitler's anti-Jewish policy. That was the kind of propaganda crap that people were fed. The fact was Germany was too strong, too virile, too efficient a competitor in the world market, and many a force coalesced to destroy it so that they could go on their merry ways and didn't have to feel disturbed in their comfortably situated country clubs, lodges, and so on. And so Germany was finished to all intents and purposes. And this writer here outlines in his book a brief plan of how we could rescue Germany. Let me just give you the highlights. Rush emergency food supplies to Germany. We're talking about Germany in 1946-47. Raise the base diet to 2,200 calories per person per day immediately and to 2,500 calories during this winter. Permit the Central Red Cross to function. Remove all limitations to private relief. Organize great drives under the sponsorship of government if possible to provide clothing, fuel, medicine and other necessities now lacking. Free all German war prisoners, return them to Germany, and provide them with the tools needed so they can work in Germany to feed and otherwise provide for the German people, and thereby remove a heavy burden from our shoulders. Give all prisoners full union wages for work exacted from them since VE Day, to enable them to re-establish themselves and to provide for their surviving dependents. Return all German lands and restore the Reich to 1937 borders. Hold plebiscites in all other territories heavily populated by Germans in 1937, Danzig in Austria included, to determine in harmony with the Atlantic Charter under what flag these people wish to live. To relieve the present unbearable population pressure, encourage all countries with low population densities, such as the United States, Canada, Latin America, Australia, and Africa, to lower the bars and permit the excess German populations to emigrate. Extend all possible aid to rebuild German cities, restore essential public service, and create decent housing facilities. Remove all limitations to industrial production and encourage highest possible output, except munitions, in harmony with the themes that prosperity like peace is indivisible. Encourage German foreign trade in order to enable the Germans to maintain themselves as soon as possible. Place a value on the mark in terms of other currencies to make private German foreign trade possible. Permit production and operation of commercial airships and ocean-going vessels. Rehabilitate national finances and forestall inflation by stabilizing the currency. Contract existing currency by calling in outstanding marks and exchanging them for new marks on some such basis as 5 old for 1 new, and make all debts come some such basis as 5 old for 1 new, and make all debts and contracts payable in the new marks at the same ratio in place of the old. Let experts decide the exact ratio needed for this operation, which will aim to bring the price level down to that of 1937. Thereafter, changes in the total supply of means of payment should be made to correspond to changes in the national capacity to produce. Lower taxes to revive incentives and the profit motive. Remove all limitations on scientific research and invention, with prohibitions continued only in the fields of atomic fission, poison gas and weapons of war. Draw up a peace treaty with Germany and officially end the war. Allow the Germans to set up a unified central government of their own choosing in harmony with the Atlantic Charter, with only such external controls as those mentioned below. Encourage the Germans to frame a constitution for themselves, with all parties advocating dictatorship or revolution barred from the Constitutional Convention. Thereupon withdraw all occupation troops, remove the military governments and abolish all zones. Continue disarmament permanently, however, and prohibit production of munitions and all weapons of war. To enforce United Nations controls, install a system of observation and surprise inspection by roving patrols permitted to inspect any and all records and activities backed by the military might of the United States and other United Nations. Violators will be tried before German courts by Allied prosecutors, with verdicts subject to appeal and retrial if necessary before Allied tribunals. Insist on abolition of all discrimination in favor of displaced persons and others, and make all persons in Germany equal before the law. Withdraw the re-education program as gracefully and soon as possible. Replace the general anti-Nazi decrees with specific laws forbidding propagation and advocacy of certain clearly defined and specific ideas or activities, making these prohibitions apply to all alike. Now, here is what happened. Germany has no peace treaty as of this 1996 date. Germany has only been partially allowed to be reunited. No plebiscites were held in the areas where Germans lived before 1937. The solution of the Allies that they agreed to in Potsdam and in Yalta was to, and in Tehran, undoubtedly behind the scenes, was to drive the Germans out. And 17 million German people, in effect, lost their homes in Eastern Europe and all their property. The German nation collectively was robbed mercilessly. Germany today is still 50 years plus after the war a vassal state of the Allies. It is a repressive regime that allows no freedom of speech the way we know it. And America and the rest of the Western Allies have a lot to answer for with the situation now in Germany. I'm Ernst Zundel with another Voice of Freedom program. Auf Wiedersehen.